Welcome to Transformation at CIIS. Listen and be transformed. And welcome everyone into the space. I will do an accessibility check-in in a moment. I will share land acknowledgements and agreements for the space, and then I will introduce Cryée and Mordecai. We will have a conversation about disability justice, and then we're opening the space for Q&A. So that is our plan today. I'm hoping that we have already launched the live transcript, enabled that transcript. Sometimes I see things and sometimes not, so just that piece. Oh, thank you very much. All right, so want to just take a moment before we dive into anything else for an accessibility check-in. And I shared with Mordecai that it was Mordecai who taught me about accessibility check-ins when we first met. And I thought to myself, this is something that I want to carry forward as much as I can. And so I teach a course and I always start it with an accessibility check-in. And so for us today, I would love if you would like to disclose publicly what your accessibility needs might be. You could drop it in the chat. Or if you would prefer to share it directly with me, you can send me or Paula, because I'll be kind of in and out of attending to the chat, to me or Paula, something that is needed. I've learned in this process of doing accessibility check-ins that there is a range of what that means. And for me, I've learned that sometimes it means pausing, like someone might need me to slow down. It's no limit. So I welcome, and if it feels meaningful and we're a small group, to come off, because I know chat can have its limitations. So if you feel so moved to come off mute as well, please do, and just let us know what you need. Mordecai or Cryée, is there anything that you would add to that? Because I expressed at the beginning, I am new to this process and want to be sure that I covered all the ground. No? Okay, cool. All right. So thank you. And before we actually jump in, I'll do a visual description when all three of us are on the screen. That feels like the time to do the visual description. All right, so I want to take a moment to make a few acknowledgements. I would first like to acknowledge that we operate, gather, and benefit every day on the land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. They are the enduring caregivers of this place, known as San Francisco and the Bay Area. We seek to stand in solidarity with the indigenous people of this land by doing our part to honor our shared histories and to take steps toward righting the wrongs of the past. I would also like to acknowledge those who have labored that we might gather here today, those who work at CIIS and in the CIIS community, the people who are rarely acknowledged but make all this possible. And I often think of our custodial staff, our administrative staff, the staff behind the scenes, the people in our community. When I'm walking to and from BART, there's a whole slew of people working to make our communities feel whole and safe and protected. And so I acknowledge the labor that goes into not only my space that I'm in, the entire CIIS space, and that surrounding space. So I just want to take that moment now to acknowledge the labor that makes all this possible. And then finally, I would like to acknowledge all those who came before us, those we know and those we do not know, those we hold dear and those who loved us long before we arrived here. I hold now the complexities for those we didn't know, for those who may have been difficult or distant, and all those in between. I acknowledge them now. And if you feel so moved, please drop a name in the chat or just hold names closely. I always say that I do my work for my ancestors, my grandparents, and for my father. And so I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the folks who came before us. And I do want to lift up the work of the Beyond Land Acknowledgement Task Force at CIIS. I am in an advisory capacity, and so I offer just a few things that we can all do to move beyond land acknowledgement. We can certainly learn about the land that we occupy by visiting native-land.ca. We can learn more about the history that doesn't get taught in our schools. We can learn about our state, our city, our locality, our national relationship, and we can certainly support Native American vendors. And so there are links there that I will be sure get dropped into the chat so you can have access to all of that after. Thank you for that. Also, we always have agreements. I am a lover of agreements. So I want to offer these to get us started. Practicing complete confidentiality and consent. And that simply means being in the space, if someone says something, not leaving the space what this person said. And also, being able to, if you have a follow-up question for someone, say to someone, can I ask about that thing that you shared? And getting consent before proceeding. Welcoming discomfort, like one of the greatest things I've ever learned from my mindfulness practice is that to notice what you notice, and that discomfort is telling you something. So welcome it, and then, see what it's trying to tell you, right? Trying on non-judgment. So that's moving away from the binary good, bad distinction and welcoming again with curiosity, something that might feel different for you, something you might not quite understand, grounding in kindness and mutual respect, listening with cultural humility, knowing that sometimes we have to trust someone else who has had a different lived experience, using I statements. So definitely speaking from your own experience, doing our best to align intention with impact and creating space for everyone. So these are the standards. I always ask if there are additional agreements, and also I ask for some kind of reaction that says we agree. So I just want to make a space for that. All right, I see agreement generally speaking. Let's see, doom, doom, doom. All right, thank you all. All right. And Paula, if there are others that anyone drops in the chat, can we just, can you let me know? Maybe if you see anything, you can, I give you permission, Paula, to come off mute and stop me and say there's something else that, because I'm kind of, always attending here and sometimes missing what's in the chat, but thank you all for that.
I got you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So again, I'm so grateful today to have with us Cryée Jarrelle Johnson from CIIS Invalid and Mordecai Cohen Ettinger from CIIS Invalid, from CIIS, which is where I first interacted with Mordecai. And I will say that there's more. So I'm going to read a couple bios now so you all get a deeper sense of both these individuals that we have here today. So I'm going to start with Cryée. Cryée Jarrelle Johnson, he, they pronouns, is the author of Slingshot, a Night Boat Books publication, winner of the Lambada Literary Award for Gay Poetry. Johnson's writing has appeared in Poem a Day, Poetry, Prompt Press, Apogee, Boston Review, The Root, and the New York Times, among other outlets. In 2020, Johnson received a Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation. He is the social media and community engagement specialist at CIIS Invalid. Welcome so much, Cryée, for being here with us. And Mordecai Cohen Ettinger, they, them, has nearly 30 years experience as a multi-sector social justice activist and organizer, holistic healer, radical scholar, and educator. Mordecai is the founding director of the Health Justice Commons and the director of development at CIIS Invalid. Mordecai co-founded the TGI Justice Project, served as an interim co-director at Justice Now, and as interim executive director at Codicus, and my pronunciations can be, so forgive me, Outreach Services, a radical mental health organization. They are adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Their field is critical science, technology, and medicine studies. Mordecai's research spans environmental health, toxicology, to the workings of the medical industrial complex, to the neurobiology of the social nervous system and its implications with regard to collective and historical trauma, healing, resilience, and social change. I welcome you, Mordecai, and want to make space. If there's anything else that I had not mentioned in your bios that you would like to share with us about you, your background, and what brings you to this work. So I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment so that we can talk.
I feel like you covered it all for me. How about you, Mordecai?
Yeah, we're good. Great. Okay, great. Well, thank you. And Paula, I think now if you want to start the spotlight, I want to just begin our conversation. I am, again, thrilled that you are here because in my seat and the work that I do as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I encounter a lot of different experiences with the difference between disability rights and disability justice. And I feel like there's such a huge distinction to be made. So I'm just beyond for this conversation. I'm so ready to have this conversation with both of you. And so just grateful that you're here and want to open the space for you to share about the disability justice principles, and before that, want to do a visual description. I'm Damali. I have silver hair, black rimmed glasses. I think of myself as a light-skinned, almost caramel complected, black bodied person. I have gold earrings, brown lipstick, and this black hoodie. And so I want to pass it to both of you to also do a visual description and then jump into the beginning around the 10 principles.
Sure. Hi, I'm Cryée. I use he, him pronouns. I have shoulder length, dreadlocks, in a bob style, I'd say. I am a light-skinned Black person. I have a teeny tiny beard, and I'm wearing like a spring green checkerboard and cream sweater with yin yangs and big pink and periwinkle flowers. And my background is blurred out.
This is Mordecai speaking, everyone. Thank you, Cryée and Damali. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a white-skinned person with dark and silvery hair that's short-ish and pushed back behind my ears. I have an ample forehead and nose and some facial hair, and I'm wearing a green and blue, I guess like khaki colored checkered shirt with a navy shirt underneath, and my background is blurred as well.
Thank you. And actually, I've neglected to talk about my background. I have a basket, which is white. It's made of straw and white cloth. I have a pink pillow behind me and a bookshelf with lots of different books. So that is what you'll see in my background. So thank you again. And I would love to turn it to you to talk about, to begin us by talking about the 10 principles of disability justice and why those are so important to understand. And so either one of you can start us in that direction.
You were around when they were being made, Mordecai. Maybe you should start.
Okay, we're both very polite. I'm like, so I should go first. In my mind. Okay, if that's what you're thinking, Saray, that's fine for me. One of the things that this is Mordecai speaking, one of the things that I wanted to speak about, maybe even prior to us talking about the 10 disability justice principles, is one, what ableism is. And then I think there'll be a question about this later that you are planning on asking us, Damali, but like, what distinguishes disability rights from disability justice, which can like give us a little bit of a framework of why disability justice is important and where it comes from. But I want to make sure that that is cool with you, Saray, if we kind of take a detour there first. Okay. So yeah, at CIIS Invalid, one of the things that we talk about and train about a lot is that it's really, it's very difficult to understand and begin to practice disability justice if we don't understand ableism, and that it exists and that it's deeply entrenched and pervasive, and it's, you know, just as the other systematic oppressions kind of are functioning simultaneously and prop each other up, ableism is a part of that. And there's quite a few really excellent definitions of ableism that are available. A couple that I want to bring to everyone's attention are CIIS Invalid's definition, and also the working definition of ableism by T.L. Lewis. And I can put a link in the chat for in a moment where you can see T.L. Lewis's definition online. And I will also, I'll first just read out loud disability, CIIS Invalid's definition of ableism. So ableism is the system of discriminatory practices and beliefs that maintain and perpetuate disability oppression, assigning inferior value or worth to people who have developmental, emotional, physical, or psychiatric impairments. Ableism is always racialized, gendered, and heterosexist, as it is co-constructed with white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism, the extractive economy, and other forms of systemic oppression. Ableism is utilized or, you know, deployed, impacts us at the interpersonal level to the institutional and systemic level. I can go ahead and I think that will fit in the chat. So that's from CIIS Invalid. And then here, for some additional info, rather than reading it out loud, here's some additional information about ableism from T.L. Lewis, and I highly recommend T.L.'s working definition of ableism as well. That was just updated in January of 22, so this past January. So it's incredibly important that when we learn about disability justice and we begin to practice it and implement it in our own lives and in the organizations that we're a part of, that ableism is this ongoing process, this force of oppression that we're always dealing with. And I think in a lot of ways, it's the one that our social justice communities are still least familiar with. And I think really it's taken the hardships, the trauma and turmoil of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic for broader communities and even the broader public as a whole to really wake up to the fact that not only are our healthcare systems not meeting our human needs, but that ableism is a thing. And ableism, one of the things that T.L. Lewis talks about is that ableism impacts all of us, even those of us that might not identify as chronically ill or disabled. And that's a really important thing to think about. It's also really important to recognize and know that in the US right now, 1 in 4 people are disabled or chronically ill. For queer people, it's actually 1 in 3 people, and that the ongoing pandemic is a mass disabling process. So the UK Guardian recently reported the statistic of up to 40% of people who have survived COVID will get long COVID. So this is like it's huge. Like it's a universal experience to live with disability or chronic illness, and more of us are experiencing this in our lives. And ableism privileges people who are or can pass as able-bodied, and it privileges people that can participate in extractive economies, and then it also renders a lot of people disposable, and then we are made profitable that way. Disabled and chronically ill people are incredibly profitable for the medical industrial complex, and in a lot of ways we're captive markets within the medical industrial complex for the treatment or healthcare we might need, or we're literally confined in the ways in which the medical industrial complex overlaps and is entangled with the prison industrial complex and kind of carceral place institutions where people with disabilities or illnesses or elders may be confined, like nursing home or group homes. So I think like that context is so important. Ableism impacts everyone, it impacts all of us, and it has ableism invisibilizes and renders normal a lot of really harmful, damaging beliefs and practices. So I think part of the practice of disability justice is to just be like, yes, ableism is a thing, and now we need to begin to really strategically and committedly aim to expose and understand and disrupt ableism as part of how we practice disability justice. So I think that context is really important. And I've been speaking for a long time. I'm going to pass it to you in a sec, Cryée. I think the last thing I'll say about that, just as we move to talking more about disability justice, is that the disability rights movement is ongoing, and it's made some astonishing wins for me and probably all of us here. There's been some landmark legal wins going back way before the ADA in 1990. The first, I think 1973 was one of the first important disability rights wins, and I'm forgetting the name of the act, but I think it was like the Architectural Act that actually made it required for all federal buildings to grant physical access, which is huge, because one of the ways that ableism most impacts us is that it marginalizes and excludes people with a range of disabilities and impairments and chronic illnesses from public life. It suppresses our voice, and it inhibits our physical access as well. So that's huge. Disability rights has largely centered legal wins, which are incredibly important, and kind of creating institutions to support people with disabilities, which are also really, really important. But when we don't have people power to make sure those wins and gains are implemented, and when we just have institutions, they can easily be deployed against us. Disability justice really centers building movements, people power, community power, to have the demands for disability justice come from our movements. And another huge thing is that disability justice is led by people who are most impacted by ableism, by Black and Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and additional people of color and people of the global majority. It has been led and spearheaded by those leaders when you thanked me for bringing to you in our meeting the practice of inviting people to share their access needs. That comes from disability justice. That comes from BIPOC leaders in the movement from whom I learned. And really, my life has been saved by this work, literally. So I think that's just a little bit more of the context that I want to share as I pass it over to Cryée. And thank you for your patience, everyone. I spoke for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think one other major difference between disability rights and disability justice is that disability rights is reluctantly coalitional, right? So before disability rights movement, before the ADA, like a person who had cancer and a blind person might not think of themselves as necessarily being part of the same community, right? They might think of themselves as under individual impairments. And prior to that, the government covered them under like individual impairments, right? So there were programs for the blind and programs for the deaf and, carceral madhouses for people experiencing psychiatric impairment. And death for people who had chronic illnesses and hysteria diagnosis and hysterectomies, right? And so people did not so much think of themselves as a coalition. And we can see that by its omissions, right? So the ADA is an extremely conservative set of laws that compose a compromise with people like Jesse Helms. It's signed under Bush 1. So by no means does it convey the sort of radicality inherent for disability justice. And we can see even now when, one of the largest, and most government reserved groups of people with chronic illnesses is, in HIV services, right? And they were explicitly written out of the ADA, right? So for the first years of the ADA, the compromise was we will not support any disability claims for people with HIV or AIDS. Specifically, transgender people were written out of the ADA, right? Explicitly, like not like, oh, like, can you? And so gender dysphoria is just now, winning its first few cases under the ADA. So it is incidentally coalitional. It united a bunch of people, who thought of themselves as being incredibly disparate and for political reasons, and said, we're all kind of a thing now, right? Whereas disability justice starts from the coalition and then prepares for that, right? Even when you think of the framers of ADA, you'll notice that it's the richest, whitest group of people that you will come across in the disability community, right? It is like rich, white, by and large men, some women, but when I say wealthy, right, like these are folks who already, like even thinking about like when I like interact with like founders, it's like it's often on like something like a yacht, like I remember, I had an experience on like the world's first accessible yacht, and that's where you'll see a lot of disability rights folks. And I don't mean any shade by that, right? That's just the facts of it. And so when you think about disability justice, a lot of us are coming from different movements, right? Like I was radicalized in the sex worker rights movement. I was repoliticized in Black Lives Matter, right? And I come to disability justice around and through those, right? And I think that that's true for a lot of people involved in disability justice, right? Folks are coming from queer and trans rights, folks are coming from reproductive justice, folks are coming from labor justice. And so the intersectionality was there from the start, right? It's a feature, not a bug. And I think that that's one of the major differences. Also, it is completely possible to not have justice, but have rights, right? It's impossible to have justice, but no rights, because rights are a part of justice, right? So that's one of the other major differences that I'll highlight here. And then I guess we can go to the next question.
Man, and I feel like so there's so many things just coming like swirling up for me. Like the one thing I suppose I want to start with is this idea of the lawmakers, of the people who contributed to the ADA, to disability rights, versus the people most impacted who know and live experiences that they are saying we need to attend to. even if they aren't written in the laws. That's what I'm hearing you make that distinction and name the fact that those laws are lacking. That's what I'm hearing. And, you know, I think it's a great place to start, because what I see so often is that we still rely on laws and not people. We still point to policy and not to this person expressed the need. Why do you think it's so important to attend to individual needs versus simply adhering to laws? Why do you think that's important?
Well, the law will always be lacking, right? Because of who our lawmakers are. Like, it's not like there's never going to be a time when we're like, we live under a system of perfect law. You know what I mean? Like, that's such a, in my mind, like, not only is that like white supremacists, it's also like weirdly Christian supremacists too, you know, because it's like, who's perfect law? Like, under like whose mandate? Like, there will never be perfect law. And in part because power corrupts, right? Power is a force of oppression in itself, and the unequal distribution of power, especially, I mean, in an anti-capitalist system, right? Like, one of the principles of disability justice is an anti-capitalist politic, because it's just like, you cannot have justice and capitalism. Like, you will never have both of those, in the same way that you will not find justice under the law, you know? Like, any of us, like, I am a Black person, like, there is no way that I can't afford to believe that I'm going to find justice under the law at any time. It would be foolish for me to think that. But at the same time, I think that one of the reasons it's important to be responsive is because the people who are most impacted change, like, it changes rapidly. So like, I would not actually say that like a rich white person who uses a wheelchair and is a quadriplegic is not part of a community most impacted by disability. I would not say that necessarily. I think that it's relative, right? Like, it depends. Like, are we talking about getting into a supermarket? Or are we talking about like not being eliminated through eugenics? Are we talking about like not experiencing medical racism? Or are we talking about like the depths of medical ableism, right? Like, are we trying to have a child, or are we like trying to fly on the plane without like losing your wheelchair, right? It depends. And I think that that's something that can be very uncomfortable, because inside of coalitional identities, and I have many of them. So like, I, you know, even like a light-skinned Black person, right? Like, there's an urge to flatten, like, we're all disabled, we're all Black, we're all trans. In itself, like, identity markers are not meaningful, right? Like, it does not actually tell you the level of impactedness that a person necessarily has. What we can do is evaluate the moment at hand and see who's suffering under our present moment, and adjust and adapt. And I think that that's one thing that, as disability justice as a tent grows into like a wider disability consciousness, needs to be rewritten in, right? Because, you know, you can be disabled and like not impacted very significantly by ableism, you know, like you might experience some, but like, it's not going to necessarily be to the extent as other people. And I think that it's important to reality check. And I think that especially in liberal and radical communities, it's important that we reality check, right? So that we don't erroneously center ourselves.
Thank you. Mordecai, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I just think, this is Mordecai speaking. I just think what you shared, Cryée, was really very profound and on point, which is pretty much what happens every time Cryée opens his mouth. But so I'm really glad to be here with you, Cryée. I think that the other thing that you were making me think of, Cryée, with what you shared, is that another important principle of the disability justice, the 10 DJ principles, is cross-disability solidarity. So I think there's this point of convergence where the wisdom from our individual experience becomes collective knowledge and collective power, and that's reflected very well in cross-disability solidarity and that principle. So, you know, we have a lot to learn from one another when we really listen to each other about what the systems that we kind of co-create and the cultures that we co-create need to look like in order for us to create a society that really centers collective access, which is another one of the 10 principles. So and collective access doesn't mean like inclusion in this very kind of like watered down, way that isn't actually taking into account people's true struggles and the true injustices that we faced and the oppressive histories attached to them. It's like, no, it's like someone gets to be fully whole and fully participate in our society and actually like have the kind of life that they want for themselves, that they're not stuck in cycles of just, barely surviving. And so that means that like there's a lot of particularity for each person's experience, just because like when you actually disrupt ableism, you realize that people's unique experiences and their needs vary greatly. Because like one of the things that ableism does, as you were saying this, it flattens everything out. It makes us think that human beings are like cookie cutters and that we're all the same, and that there's like this kind of vast conformity of our expectations of what we all need. And like, that's not actually the reality of lived experiences in bodies. And then, of course, there's some really intense extremes that unfortunately, because of ableism, we're vastly ignorant about. So your example of someone wanting to fly on a plane and facing the risk of having their wheelchair misplaced, like it's very pertinent now because people might be trying to travel for the holiday season. And that is like, people might think if you don't, because of ableist narratives, and if you don't have lived experience or know someone who is a wheelchair user, but like having your wheelchair misplaced could actually be lethal. Like, it is not a small thing. People think, oh, it's kind of like losing your luggage. It is not like that. It is like losing your legs. And people depend on wheelchairs for so many aspects of their survival, every aspect of your survival and daily life. And people have complex physical needs often that use wheelchairs. So to have to use a sub wheelchair until your wheelchair that could be thousands of dollars finally tracked down, or even worse, replaced, could really create health conditions and emergencies for your body that could lead to your death. And this has happened to members of our communities more than I can count, and certainly more than I want to recall. So it's like, it's those types of things where like, that's a shocking example of ableism, where like, it's just people are treated so disposably. Air carrier companies should just not do that. Like, that's not that hard to not lose a thing that's like essential for someone's survival, but yet it happens all the time. But then at the same time, I think there's this kind of the denial about the pandemic, and that it's ongoing and that it's impacting many of us is I think another example of the pervasive ableism that we're speaking to. And then also conditions that can be disrupted when we understand and enact the disability justice principles, kind of particularly this piece of cross disability solidarity, where we're thinking about it beyond rights, and we're thinking about it of like how we want to live, and what we need to live, and how we need to kind of transform the conditions that we're in, and normalize that like we actually want to have institutions and cultural practices that meet our needs, and that when we do that, everyone lives more wholly and more free. Yeah, I will wrap it up there.
Thank you. And quickly, can you both touch on the 10 principles? Because you alluded to them, you brought a couple of them into the space, and I had someone in the chat ask, can we say more about the 10 principles? So can you take a moment to do that? And then what I'll do is, we actually have CIIS Invalid's book on our reading list. The Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion has a reading list, and we have your book. And I think the 10 principles are listed in that book. I'm almost like 100% sure. And so what I'll do is drop a link to that the library offers to the CIIS community in the chat, but just give you a moment to say a couple, what feels right about the 10 principles.
Yeah. Just before we say that, I think that it's also important for us to be so fucking for real about what solidarity actually is, right? Because it's easy to say, like, oh, yeah, like solidarity, it means that, like, I have friends who have higher support needs than I do, or I have friends of other races. That's me being in solidarity, or I like give money to this cause. Solidarity is a lot more complicated than that. And sometimes it means going from the bottom up instead of from the top down, because it is very easy. I see a lot of efforts in solidarity start with whatever, like whoever has the most access to rights and justice, and hope that it just kind of gets to people who have less access to that eventually. And that's not solidarity, right? Like we listen to everyone, and like everyone's insights are absolutely important. And everyone is not suffering equally under an ableist system. Like we're just not. Like we simply are. And I say this as somebody who's not at the bottom or the top, you know, like I recognize that I have much more privilege than some people in disability communities. I have much less privilege than other people, and less access to power. And I think that without being, again, so fucking for real about like how much power we hold over others, we cannot achieve solidarity. That being said, the 10 principles are intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalist politic, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And there are links that are in the chat so that you can access that list yourself. And I really appreciate your making that, clear about solidarity. And so often in my seat, I am thinking about just how much we've been socialized into ableism, and continually to check in with myself, even as someone who identifies as someone with a person with a disability. I still recognize just how kind of normalized ableism is. And so thank you for that. I want to just ask a couple questions before I open it up for everyone else to ask questions, but I wanted to bring us to our institution, to CIIS, to the higher education space in particular, because again, in my seat, I often get emails or concerns raised that I thought would be important to have your thoughts about. So for example, we recently had a major shift in a technology that we used. And so, the way it was done kind of went away, and there was this new technology, new hardware, software, this whole kind of navigating the new. And out of that came a lot of kind of expressions of, this feels ableist. This feels like we haven't thought about everyone and what everyone needs. And for me, I thought to myself, I wish I'd had some answers about how something like that, like something that seems insignificant maybe to some populations and like a minor shift, could be such a major shift for especially some individuals. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about something like that happens at an institution from a disability justice lens. What does it look like to make a change to especially technology that gives everyone access to emails, to their coursework, so just curious if you had any thoughts about how that could be done through a disability justice lens.
You work here, Mordecai, so you want to go first?
Okay, that sounds good. This is Mordecai, everyone. I think at an organization, at an institution, that is of significant size, such as CIIS, it can be quite challenging because, an ideal process would be to do an inventory and needs assessment to see what's really going to work the best for everyone, which, as I mentioned, can be time consuming, and it can be expensive, and it can be challenging to get everyone to participate. particularly because, you know, capitalism is an economic system that really controls and depletes our time. So even if, you know, an institution like CIIS is like, we're doing our due diligence, and that's why we're asking people to have this one-on-one conversation or do this survey, it can just become an extra thing for people to participate in, and therefore really challenging. So I think like that is a big challenge, like figuring out, okay, how do we get everyone's input in a way that's accessible for everyone? So I think like, you know, one concrete thing could be like, well, we're going to have people do a 20-minute survey, and we're going to give them a little gift card to do it so they can treat themselves to a meal when they're done, or we're going to pay people overtime, like something to just make it a little bit easier. And then, you know, I think perpetually for all of the work that we do online, it's helpful to like get the information in email, but then also like when folks are in meetings, you know, to have a verbal reminder, because in reality, I think many of us are dealing with sensory overload, and we need to receive the information in different ways, like when we need to take action. So I think that's another thing, like giving people the information in different ways so we can actually kind of process it. And then I think the other piece is a longer term process, and it's a process of, you know, how do we engage in disability justice at every level of our work? And that certainly means in implementing, choosing and implementing new technologies. So I think a big piece of that is that if even, you know, a handful of people are having difficulty, then it's not an accessible technology or practice, and it needs to be reassessed. That doesn't mean you have to, quote unquote, you know, throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. It might mean, okay, we understand that there's like maybe 12% of like, I don't know, 5%, 2%, this amount of folks for whom this isn't working. Can we connect with those people and see what accessibility workarounds we can create for those people, as opposed to making the people that are experiencing those challenges the problem. You know, that can happen all too often as a consequence of ableism. Those people are being non-compliant. Those people are lazy. Those people are just making excuses. Like, it's very important that we challenge that type of thinking and are just like, no, this isn't working. Let's take people's concerns seriously and have a can-do kind of like problem-solving oriented attitude towards it. Because I think we as disabled and chronically ill people are like fantastic problem solvers, you know, like we have had to be very resourceful to survive, certainly for those of us to kind of sustain our work in institutions as well. You know, it's not the easiest. So I think those are some practices that we can begin to institute. And you know, I think it's a very big institution. Like I said, I've been incredibly fortunate to work in the BA completion program, and I have my former department head here, Chris Brandenberger, who is an amazing person who's just done an exceptional job, I think, in implementing practices in our department in the past. And so I think we can learn from each other here. So I think like that's another way in which way things can be implemented, because we have these big groups, you know, these big formations, but then within that we have smaller formations where people, you know, are in smaller working groups, smaller settings. So there is more kind of intimacy where there can be more solution creation around collective access, and then that information can kind of be fed back to the broader system. I think those are some things that that occur to me just as an initial pass to this, you know, to this really big and important question. I guess the last thing I'll say very quickly is that we shouldn't be frustrated with, we should empower the people who are kind of making these choices and doing these assessments and trying to implement these systems with disability justice frameworks, and also the understanding of like a lot of patients for them, because technology is not accessible. There's deeply embedded ableist assumptions and practices, algorithms, layers and layers of ableism in these technologies that tries to get people to kind of conform to certain ableist behaviors or ideas of being. So the technologies themselves can be incredibly challenging and limited. So we should take that into account.
Thank you so much, Mordecai. And the point that you made about, I find it to be one of our socializations, but also very ableist, that if the majority are okay, we kind of feel like we've done our job. And so I really appreciated that point that you made. Saray, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I also think, as a librarian, as someone who comes from like a diversity, equity, inclusion librarian background, we have to understand that like there is no one ring to rule them all, right? Like there is not one solution that we can put into place that is going to be accessible to absolutely everyone. And that is why many institutions fall into the trap of being like, no, you must do it this way, which is inherently inaccessible, right? There has to be workarounds for students, administrators, faculty to do it another way. And I think that one thing to know about the ADA is like, because I think this is a common misunderstanding, is that people think you could just be like, hey, that's against the ADA, so change it now. That is not the system that the ADA operates on. It's an incredibly litigious foundation because it was made by rich people, right? So it's like, okay, the only way to make sure that your rights under the ADA are protected is to lawyer up. So who is that accessible to? Which means that a lot of institutions, they only kind of will put disability into their policies, particularly around accessibility for students, when they think they'll be sued. So when it's a large enough student population that they believe that they will be sued. And so that means that physical disabilities are pretty rarely accommodated, since people with physical disabilities tend to be poorer on average. And it means that the largest group of students with disability, which is often, I am an autistic person, is often neurodivergent people, people with neurodivergences that do not come with intellectual disabilities. Very important, because that is also a privileged group, right? Like neurodivergent people who come with intellectual disabilities are some of the least privileged people in disability communities. And we know because they are being systemically targeted by the government for slaughter and eugenics at a rate that is unparalleled, right? But that being said, we, like when I was at Columbia, first of all, we were up a hill, right? An icy hill. Second of all, we were up many flights of stairs at all times with one elevator. I was never offered the opportunity to come to class 5 minutes late, even though as a transgender student, I had to leave the building and go down the street to use the bathroom. I was offered more time to take a test. What is that going to do for me? Like that doesn't do anything for me. But you believe that people who have, Asperger's syndrome, as I do, and people with ADHD are going to sue you. You don't think that me with lupus is going to sue you. So you're not going to accommodate me, right? You're just not. It doesn't mean that folks with neurodivergences without intellectual disability aren't experiencing discrimination in the classroom. It means that as a group of people who are disabled, just like the framers of the ADA, there is a consequence for fucking with them. And so it's really important that when we think about creating accessible pathways to technology, that we're not just thinking about the students who we hear the most or who are the largest populations, that we are systematically surveying students about the disabilities that they have and their barriers to using technologies, and also just like other things on campus, right? Because it's great to be able to use like the library's catalog system. And it's great too to get in the library. You know what I mean? It's great to get in the library, but it's better to be able to use the pool too, right? You pay for the whole campus and you should be able to use the whole campus. But often we're not thinking that way because the ADA, again, is litigious or causes you to be litigious if you want to enforce it.
Thank you so much. It raises for me this diagnosed versus undiagnosed, this like named versus, or visible versus invisible set of disabilities. And, I know that compliance, you mentioned the litigious nature of this realm, like, the fact that people respond to litigation, right? So, but again, who has access to the lawyer up, so you've raised all these amazing points. And the thing that I want to figure out in this conversation, which may not get figured out, but I want to offer into the space for people to consider, is how do you meet all the needs? Like, how do you, and you mentioned surveying or asking, right? Like being sure that we understand who has needs, accessibility needs, even if they don't, fall under, I guess, the list of diagnosed or the visible. But, what other steps are there other steps that we can take as an institution to be sure that, you know, no one gets left behind in this conversation? And that would be my final question, then I want to open the space because I'm sure people will have questions.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly because I think that the answer is no. Institutions are like the law in this fact that they are not designed to be accessible, right? They're not. Like they are designed, an institution like a college is designed to exclude, right? Or else they would not have an admissions process. They would just be like, here are some resources for all that need resources, right? Like the design of educational institutions is inherently exclusive. And it's also based on intellectual ability, which itself is ableist, right? So like without fundamentally destroying the university as a system and an institution, no, there will not be a radically inclusive path forward any more than there will be an anti-racist, like university space. Like it's just not, we would have to reinvent, like we would have to tear the universities down and then like be like, okay, we're going to start from scratch, disregarding like everything from the Greeks on to create this new system. But that's just me.
I appreciate it because that's an honest answer, and I think we need that. And yeah, I live in a world where I'm wanting to reimagine and wanting to rebuild and like strip away what just is not working. And I know that I'm situated in a context. So thank you for that. Mordecai, I saw that you came off mute, please.
Yeah, this is Mordecai speaking. Thank you, Cryée. I appreciate that so much. I think that just because those very real limitations exist that Cryée articulated, there's still ways that we can engage in creative and generative resistance. And there's still ways that we can put disability justice in action. And I think one of the things that CIIS Invalid talks about is ways in which we can create liberated zones. And, of course, this is an idea that comes from Zapatismo as well. So I think there are ways that we can do that and that we can have a considerable amount of at least some power and capacity to do that in our own classrooms or in our smaller departments where we can be like, hey, like we can make sure that we have accessibility practices that all of our instructors practice. For me, it's been a long practice since I've been at CIIS to start all of my courses with land acknowledgements and access check-ins. People begin to learn what that is. And for a lot of people, that's like their minds are blown. They're like, I did not even believe that like I had the right to think about these things, or I had no idea that this existed. They didn't know what disability justice was. So it's, there's things, there are things that we can do, and then we can just make those practices more available in at least our classrooms or our departments. And that might mean that we have to do some finagling with the broader institutions of the school due to the limitations, but there's a way to, I think, work together. I think we're positioned in a good and interesting place within CIIS where we do have a social justice mandate, where I think a lot of us here take very seriously. And certainly our students do. Like I think many of our students, hold us up to that standard. They're like, well, I came here because I care about being an agent of change. That's who I want to be in the world. I think that one of the areas of challenge, and Cryée spoke to this, that I'm really encountering a lot, and I think that the institution could begin to do more concerted work, is that there's like a huge amount of gatekeeping for students with intellectual disabilities, or who are neurodivergent, or who are neurodiverse, and that is really hard to see. A lot of my students are coming to terms with this for the first time because they're in a space at CIIS where they're actually able to realize it. But then, they come up against so many barriers because there's so much gatekeeping to get a diagnosis, to get access to the access support that you need. So I think, in our department, at least, we're really good at providing provisional access supports and accommodations, until, those more gatekeeping kind of things come down the pike. But I wonder if there's like more work that the institution can do that can be like, these are the healthcare providers that we can recommend our students to have to go through less gatekeeping and scrutiny to get, an ADHD diagnosis if that's what they need. And it's this challenging thing where like people have to get a diagnosis to get the access to care or other resources, institutions that they might need. And it's a challenging set of circumstances for people to have to be in. But I think for us as faculty or student mentors, whatever, in the administration, whatever roles we have, I think what our important role is to think of like, how can we be the best advocates for students? Because we're really here, we're here for them. We're here to be accountable to them, and we're here to be accountable to these social justice commitments, despite all the limitations, which are ample, so what's the best we can do? In a lot of ways, I think we're practicing institutional harm reduction, but, I think that has an impact as well, even if it's slow and it's not the full radical transformation that we might really dream for. But hopefully we're building the foundation and the framework to make more of those bigger changes possible. Yeah.
Thank you, Mordecai. And I want to open the space for questions from our audience. And I see Michelle's hand. So Michelle, please unmute and ask your question. And then anyone else with questions, I welcome either the same raise hand. It's so easy for me to notice in that feature. But if, you raise your physical hand or alert us in the chat, that works. And yes, Paula, we can remove the spotlight now so that we can, as people ask their questions. So thank you. And Michelle, I want to turn it to you.
Yeah, this is Michelle Mueller from the Human Research Review Committee. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I am curious if you can address the term gender dysphoria. And I heard it used in this call. I'm curious because, it has been a fraught term in some cases because of pathologization. At the same time, putting a medical frame, can mean access because of insurance. Of course, that's all wealth-based as we've been talking about. But I guess what I'm really curious about is the disability justice movement at odds with any other social movement in terms of using the term gender dysphoria, or what are the politics of the label gender dysphoria today?
Yeah, since I'm the person that uses it, I'm happy to talk more about it. I also wanted to start with saying, like, there are some of us who cannot avoid pathologization, right? Like, there is not some way that people can universally avoid pathologization. Some of us will be pathologized. And I think that whenever we talk about diagnosis, we're always talking about who can resist pathologization and who cannot, right? Like that is the fundamental question of diagnosis. And if anything, I feel like that is something that puts whole communities, like, again, I'm autistic, like the conversation between like self-diagnosis, adult diagnosis, child diagnosis. I went through ABA, right? Like I went through ABA. I was literally tortured in my school. So like I wasn't able to avoid pathologization even as a child, right? So that's not, it's not realistic to think that people, if you are someone who's going, hoping that your surgery will be covered by your employer in the state of New York where I live, not every state, right? Because that's just not an option for some people, or hoping that it'll be covered by insurance. Pathology is the pathway to that. And so I think that many people cannot, I think that many of us know that we cannot escape the process of that pathologization if we want realistically to reach other goals. As far as gender dysphoria as a disability, there have been several cases over the past, I want to say 5 years, mostly brought by trans women, but there is a very, one second, I'm gonna find her name. She was working at a sporting goods store, and she was fired because she wasn't able to wear clothes that corresponded with her gender. And she brought the first ADA complaint about gender dysphoria. I can't remember her name right now, but I, followed her case, and she did end up winning the case. I think that there's no real way to conceptualize of gender dysphoria, persistent discomfort with your gender that could cause things like suicidality. I say as somebody who experiences gender dysphoria and body dysphoria as not being disabling when you're not able to actualize your gender, which is the cases that are coming forth under the ADA, right? It's not just like, I am a person and like, I will be understood as disabled because I'm experiencing gender dysphoria. The cases in which this is being tried into the ADA are cases where someone's gender dysphoria was aggravated intentionally in order to marginalize them. And I think that fat, sick, and trans people and disabled people, like we are a natural coalition if we choose to accept it, because we are medically marginalized people. We will be marginalized and pathologized by the medical community, whether we like it, don't like it, want to participate in because of insurance. We have no choice in the matter, just because our bodies are medicalized. And so, the level of pathologization we experience often has to do with, like, honestly, the proclaimed severity or the observed severity of our condition to normative bodies, right? Like, I was an autistic biter. I was diagnosed in childhood. I was not seen as a normal child. That is why I was pathologized. That's how I got a diagnosis. My diagnosis was not a privilege. It was actually something that was meant to marginalize me away from institutions. And I think that that's true for a lot of people who are bringing claims under, it's true for most childhood diagnosed people, but also people who are bringing cases under the ADA are clearly like in a position where they're like, I will not be able to resist pathologization for this marginalization. And I need assistance so that I am not consistently, or that this marginalization doesn't continue. And I'm thankful, honestly, that people are winning cases under this. I think that more people who experience ableism who are not disabled should try cases under the ADA if they can.
Thank you, Cryée. And Ray, I see your hand.
Thanks, Damali. This is Ray Johnson. I teach in the somatic psychology emphasis in the integral and transpersonal doctoral program. And I'm curious, I'm wondering what you both think of universal instructional design.
Cryée is telling me in the chat that this is something I should address first.
I saw you madly typing, but I wasn't sure what that was.
I mean, I think Cryée, working as you do as an librarian, you might have more things to share about this. I mean, I think that because of the nature of ableism, for a lot of the things that we spoke to, it's highly limited at best, and it deeply kind of like perpetuates, re-entrenches and re-enmeshes ableism at worst. And I would say the worst is a pretty persistent reality. I think that we're fortunate in the context of CIIS, where we actually do have institutional support, maybe more so than other institutions, to be able to. Sorry, my little dog is barking in the background. He's very against it. That's what he is articulating at this time. So I think we are positioned in a fortunate place where we, at least in our individual classrooms and departments, can really kind of challenge that and go beyond it. Even though now for me, I've been teaching in hybrid or online format for some time, during the pandemic, I still am able to integrate experiential aspects and somatic aspects to learning, which, given the fact that I teach natural and biological sciences, is like kind of, unheard of. But I think it's incredibly important. I think it creates the integrative learning context in which people can actually learn. So I think to the extent where within the context of CIIS, we can continue to challenge and disrupt and transform that paradigm, we should certainly do so, and that we're fortunate to be able to have institutional support and support from one another to do so. And a lot of exceptional leaders in that work, I think, here at CIIS, there's a lot of great faculty using pedagogy that goes beyond that very narrow frame.
Thank you.
And now if you have anything you'd like to add, Cryée.
Thank you. And do we have other questions? We have a few more minutes with Cryée and Mordecai. And so I really, invite you to use this time with them to ask anything that's coming up. V.
Hi, this is V. I've been listening to this, not on screen, with great enthusiasm and delight. Thank you so much for everything. I'm a PhD student here in anthropology and social change department, and my thesis is in the area of critical suicide studies. So I study suicidality with a critical lens, predominantly of the mainstream suicidality, which says that something is wrong with you, something is wrong with you, and we will fix it. As long as we identify the gene or the enzyme or something of those sorts. And then I'm not going to get necessarily into the critical suicide lens, but you would understand that along the lines of disability justice, etc., it looks at the oppression and injustice and empowerment and solidarity. So my question is around coalitions and any sort of parallel that I can listen. It's not one-to-one and it's not linear, but I'm interested in prospects for self-organizing and self-advocacy of suicidal people against stigma and suffering of suicide. So imagine if I'm saying I'm interested in prospects for self-advocacy and self-organizing of people in the disability justice movement. You would be like, well, we spoke about it and it can't, I'm trying to see if those directly affected are to work on empowerment and overcoming oppression. What are the aspects to keep in mind from the background of engagement that you have? Of course, I can imagine the suicide justice or, bye-bye. Sorry. Let me stop there. You got my question. Thank you so much. I'm asking, how do I engage with people around the question of coalitions and working together?
Absolutely. I think that one of the organizations that does this really well is Not Dead Yet. And they are specifically anti-doctor-assisted suicide. We've seen a spike of doctor-assisted suicides since Canada instituted MAID. Sweden as well, I want to say, or some, I'm pretty sure it was Sweden, where, the entire disability community became conversant quickly in the topic of suicidality because, right, it's can be pathologized individually, right? Where it's there is something wrong with you. And also it can, I think that with MAID, we also see the state saying there's something wrong with us, but you should die, right? But you should die. And the amount of things that are covered under MAID, it really will make your hair curl. I think in some ways it's that is the necessity of the Disability Justice Coalition in the first place, because when you think about all of the different reasons that MAID has been approved for people, it's okay, so this is our coalition, right? whether it's somebody with severe depression, whether there are several cases where someone was unhappy with their gender affirmation surgeries and were approved for MAID. There are, there have been young children, right? Like I think about Jerica Bolin all of the time, where like she was a 14-year-old Black girl and was approved for doctor-assisted suicide, right? So in some ways, the Coalition of Disability Justice are people who are disproportionately affected by not just suicidality, but like forced and enforced suicidality, and who are in many ways encouraged to be suicidal. I'm encouraged to think of their lives as being disposable. So I think that all things considered, Not Dead Yet is a great place to look at coalition, but I do think that like self-advocacy and disability justice communities are organizing against mass death, period. And deaths of despair. And so like self-advocacy in the disability justice community is an insulating factor against mass suicidality. And that being said, we'll have to think of other effective tools, right? Because I know that within my own community, I can think of 10 people offhand who have committed suicide within the last 10 years. And I think that, a lot of people who share my demographics can as well. And so when we think of self-advocacy itself can be a form of organizing against suicide, but also many, it's complicated too, because like there are whole groups of disabled people who are considerably more conservative just because of how often they are targeted for eugenics. I think about like communities of folks with Down syndrome is a really good example. Where there's been coalitions for years, like against abortion, because they are being targeted for systematic annihilation around the world. And so thinking about people's right to live, people's right to life, thinking about suicidality and suicide prevention as a form of reproductive justice, and also disability justice as an inherently coalitional politic that engages in complicated coalitions, right? Like I'm absolutely pro-abortion, and also I think that, the ways that we speak about abortion can also often be eugenicist. And so thinking about people's right to live their lives, disabled people's rights to exist, period, gets us into some incredibly complicated territory. And also people's agency, right? It's your right to live, it's your right to die. And at the same time, those things are overdetermined in a society that hates disabled people and wants to see us all dead.
Thank you. I appreciate your last sentence because these are the two aspects of the issue that are considered, as opposites, but actually they are very much interrelated because that's what happens when you talk to the people who are experiencing them. And one is how to live good life, and the other one is how to die good death. And where is the agency? And where is the agency in all this, depending and related to the context and the systems in which we live. Thank you so much. I don't know if Mordecai wants to say, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I appreciate you, Siri.
We definitely have a few minutes left. Thank you so much for that, V. So Mordecai, please, if you wanted to add something.
This is Mordecai. I thought Soreya's answer was thorough and really brilliant. The only last thing that I would uplift is I think there is also a natural coalition among the communities of people that you're working with, Violeta or V, and anti-eugenicist movements, which often overlap with disability justice communities, because the right to live a livable life, and this pushback against the creeping eugenicist amplification that I think has been, on the rise even more during this ongoing pandemic period is kind of part of this whole reentrenchment and rise of ableism. And these are some of the ways that it's manifesting. Yeah. So connecting with anti-eugenics movement and broader disability justice movements.
Thank you so much, Mordecai. Is there any final question for our guests, our presenters today? We have just about 5 minutes left, and if there is any, final question, I would love to make the space for it. Rachel.
Hi, Siri and Mordecai. Thank you for being here. My name's Rachel. I identify as a peer in the mental health care movement and have for years at CIIS been advocating for inclusion and representation in our predominantly psychology programs at CIIS. And V said this word that I was waiting to talk about, stigma. How does stigma impact disability justice movements, not just societal stigma, but internalized stigma to get folks who are most impacted mobilized?
Yeah, that's a really, this is Mordecai speaking. That's a really profound question, Rachel. I think, stigma cuts closely to shame. And shame is one of the most kind of immobilizing and isolating things that humans can experience. And it is very much deployed against oppressed people very intentionally. And it's hugely deployed against people with a range of disabilities, impairments, chronic illnesses. And I think, again, this gets back to the pervasiveness of ableism that we sometimes overlook, that it's so ingrained, normalized, and internalized by all of us that our worth is tied to how we conform to heterosexist and white supremacist able-bodied norms. How we can work, how we can produce, how we can in these really fixed and limiting and like deeply dehumanizing and unrealistic ways. That is no bodies and no people really fit those. So I think an entry point for mobilization is having liberatory frameworks available for people. That's one entry point at least, right? So, and then there can be, small on-ramps for those things, like instituting accessibility practices, but not just saying, when I invite my students in our first course session, share your access needs. I explain that it comes from a disability justice framework, and I explain what it is and why I am inviting people to do it. And then that opens a door for people, even if it's a tiny crack, to begin to think about themselves and their own life and their own experience and their communities and the people that they love in a slightly different way. And then that opening can build upon itself over time towards mobilization. I think, particularly in your program area, Rachel, teaching about disability justice, teaching the principles, which I integrate into almost all of my curriculum, is incredibly powerful for people. We've recommended and provided the link for the CIIS Invalid Disability Justice Primer, but that really is a great intro to disability justice for people. I share with it, when I share it with people, I say this is really like required readings for our time. And I think like those are some very concrete ways that can open up a path to mobilization for people. And then I think holding space for more collective learning and more conversation and more sharing, holding space where people can be vulnerable with each other without the fear of repercussions or being shamed or rejected. Can go a huge long way. So I think there's different practices and curriculum that we could begin to integrate. And then there's some suggestions between Damali and Chris in the chat about keeping this conversation going with different layers and communities of the aspects of the CIIS broader institution. So that's in other concrete ways where we can, incite, catalyze, or support people to be mobilized. And there's just like some very simple things that we're probably already doing, or at least I hope we are, just trying to hold witness for each other in our whole humanity. That can be, especially when we don't get that in every aspect of our lives, like that, those small things, those small moments can over time be very mobilizing. So those are some concrete suggestions. And I would love Cryée to be able to kind of close us out with some thoughts too.
Yeah, there's a lot of disability stigma, particularly in the Black community, and that goes back to the history of enslavement, right? Like there is no such thing as a non-disabled enslaved person, like there just wasn't. But there were also big penalties under enslavement for being disabled, right? So when we talk about playing the dozens, we know that what that meant was that disabled and elderly slaves were sold by the dozen. And so we know the repercussions of being disabled under those conditions, and they pervade to this day. Even thinking about COVID-19 in the history of, like, say, smallpox in the Black community being associated with Black people and Native Americans, et cetera, right? So like our understandings of disability, like Blackness and disability are like inherently diseased, impervious disease, inherently disabled, and unable to be disabled because they are just so fit, right? Because we believe contradictory things about Black people in the United States. And I think one thing that I've found really effective organizing Black disabled people is focusing on disablement rather than disability necessarily. I think that in white communities, a lot of times there is a lot of like, you must identify as disabled, you have to identify as politically disabled. But how do people get there, right? Like, if you can't understand your marginalization, you know, like if you're born in a Black body, like you're gonna understand like racism like works to marginalize you. If you become disabled, or even born with a disability, depending, but like if you become disabled, you don't necessarily have that same time to build up your understanding of how, like, and why you're being treated the way you are. And so disablement, by which I mean the way that culture creates an underclass through making groups of people, kinds of people in specific locations disabled so that care can be withheld without repercussions, is really helpful in organizing Black people around disability and disablement. And I think that, like, just remembering that, like, not all, like, when stigma does rear up and people are like, I don't want this because this is associated with disability, which is associated with lack. It's also like just important to remember that like not all disabilities are inherently debilitating, right? That like this is a system of marginalization and interpersonal classification, so that an underclass can be created, just like race, just like gender, right? That there is no inherent, like, there may be differences in needs, but there's not a difference in quality of human, right? That these categories are created and can be understood without it necessarily meaning something about you.
Thank you so much. You know, I felt throughout this conversation that I am continuing to learn. I'm continuing to understand my own ableist tendencies, and in understanding them really more consciously and more intentionally, you know, can like push them to the side and begin to create something else. And that's really what I hoped for this conversation. That any of us in this space, you know, could use this as a time to go within, to have an introspective look at where we show up in ableism, but also in conversations about disability rights and disability justice. So, Cryée, thank you so much for your wisdom, your insight, the way that you shared and showed up in this space. Thank you, Mordecai, for being such a teacher to me just in the short time that we have interacted. I really appreciate it and know that everyone here, I could speak for y'all, I'm gonna speak for y'all, is feeling overflowing, you know, with new knowledge and just gratitude. So thank you. And we are gonna close out, but I will say that we like to send surveys to ask how we're doing. So I know that our office will send out something just to hear from you about your experience of this. And we will certainly intend to continue this conversation, as Mordecai mentioned, as Chris has prompted in the chat. This is a beginning. It feels like it feels like we could continue this for many sessions, and I want to see that we do have a follow-up at some point and come, you know, like take steps to be sure that we're in a proactive place. So thank you again for being here.